Okay, so Sean Crosson has written a great new book. It's called Gaelic Games on Film. It's out right now and it comes highly recommended. I've been reading it for the last couple of days. Sean, you're very welcome to studio.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be here.
And the one thing that really struck me when reading this was just the sheer volume of archive and film and documentary that you've gone through over the past couple of years, I assume.
Yes. Well, it's been 13 years.
Wow,
journey.
okay.
The research just began back in 2006. When a friend of mine, a colleague in NUI Galway, David Doyle, asked me, he was hosting a Sports History Ireland conference, and he asked me, are there any films with Gaelic Games? And at that point I didn't really have great expectations, but it began as a curiosity that then was an extraordinary kind of discovery of the record that survives, going right back to 1914, the earliest footage we have, and then the extraordinary work that the National Film Institute did from the 40s on, and then Gael Lynn and others subsequently to preserve really the moving image history of extraordinary players of Christy Ring, for example, but from my own county Cavan, like John Joe Riley, and for many supporters, even supporters of Mayo, of counties perhaps that haven't had a lot of success in recent years, but would have to look back to those years to find, their heroes, and they're there on film. We can find the records of those players still.
You mentioned 1914, the earliest footage. When you say the earliest footage, you mean the earliest footage of a match?
Yes, it's the earliest surviving footage. So there's records that Gaelic Games were being filmed from very early. The earliest record I've got of a recording was a game from 1901, a local game in Dublin between two club teams that was screened as part of a grand Gaelic night in the Rotunda on Parnell Street back in December 1901. And it was part of, I suppose, an international fascination with sport, coming together with sport and film. And it made sense in this very new art form, very new popular cultural form of film, could look to sport that already had huge following, and also had all the elements of drama, of excitement, and unsurprisingly, when film arrived in Ireland, Gaelic Games very quickly became an important part of the repertoire of those that were making films and distributing films. And throughout the early 20th century, you find it's in, and I include some references in the book as well, even though, unfortunately, most of the very earliest films haven't survived, there's plenty of coverage in the media and the press from the period where you can see the kind of fascination with which these films were received at the time by supporters, by the general public across Ireland. And the earliest one that has survived, you mentioned, is 1914, which is the All-Ireland football final replay between Wexford and Kerry. And we have a short, about 2-minute clip from that, which in itself is extraordinary because it gives you a sense of the evolution of the sport of Gaelic football, which was quite different at that period to what it is now. For example, at that time, the ball was thrown in, soccer style, from the sideline, and there's a shot of that in the film. The game was much more played on the ground, and you might find more similarities with soccer. So it was an evolving sport. The solo run only really came into Gaelic football in the early 1920s. So in these surviving, and then when you go into the newsreels in the 20s and 30s, of which we have fortunately a considerable footage there, you can see how the sport is, both Gaelic football and hurling, are evolving, and the skills are evolving, and the kind of cultural context is evolving as well.
So these are full matches, and people are going to the cinemas around these times to actually watch full matches. And would they generally know the results in these matches going to them? They just kind of want to see it?
Yeah. Well, the films didn't record the entire game. Well, film in that period was often quite short anyway. I mean, they were usually maximum what we call one reelers, which is about 10 minutes in length. So that became the kind of the norm around sports. Would be in National Film Institute films, for example, their highlights footage from the 40s on are all 10-minute episodes. But people would have got the result through the press. And they would have gone along, but that wouldn't have changed. There would have still been great excitement to see, you can imagine, to see their heroes up on the big screen, and to kind of participate in that kind of the extraordinary moments that counties enjoyed in that period in terms of All-Ireland glory.
Yeah, for sure. Like, that's when we get into kind of the non-fiction element, for lack of a better phrase, at the very start of Gaelic Games in film. But it gets very, very interesting when you look at it in fictionalised film. And I want to play a bit of Knock na Gao here, the film based off the book. Matt leads the Knock na Gao boys in a hurling match, as you can see on screen. We're going to have a look at this while we can talk over it. And basically, like, this is the very first time that we see GAA in a fictionalised film. Is that correct to say?
It is, and not only that, it's the earliest footage we have of hurling in any film, whether fiction or non-fiction.
Right.
And what's extraordinary about this clip as well is this film was made in early 1918, released in 1918, based on the most popular book in Ireland in the 19th century. Basically, there was not a household in Ireland that didn't have a copy of Knock na Gao, Charles Kickham's book, set in Tipperary. And it's an attempt to capture hurling in the very early 20th century as it was played back, 50, 60 years earlier. So it's even going back again in terms of capturing the way in which the game was played, the shape of the hurley stick, the clothing and so on. And looking at it now, it's an extraordinarily important record for that period for us today to get a sense of hurling at the time and it's the approach to the game.
It really does. And like, what does Knock na Gao tell us, despite the fact that it's a piece of fiction about the connection between hurling and social class, like about the people who played hurling at the time?
Well, that's in the book. It's fascinating in that respect, in that it captures what was a very hierarchical structure in Irish society, and even the use of the term sport when we look at the book, and some of this comes through in the film as well, is only applied to, say, blood sports and to the upper middle and upper classes. And it's games. It's basically the labourers, farm labourers that are engaged in sport and in hurling, and it's the sport of the working classes, I guess you could describe it in the context of the book. And in that respect, it's a really important kind of window into the society at that moment in the 19th century, and the way in which sport played a vital role in terms of the expression and the definition, if you like, of the different classes in Irish society. Yeah,
and ultimately this is a time when what became the GAA, what our understanding of the GAA now is a pride of place, representing one's place, and ultimately Knock na Gao is a story based on the idea that people are going out representing their land or whatever it may be in a game of hurling, which is quite a curious foreshadowing of what the GAA will become.
Yeah, and it's in the book. You see it when the Matt the Thresher, when he goes out to play, to lead the hurlers, he goes, I'll do this for the sake of Knock na Gao. So it's very much capturing the spirit that still is a key component of what makes the GAA what it is, that connection with your local community, your local club. And extraordinarily prescient in that respect.
For sure. And when we see how hurling and when we see how Gaelic Games are depicted, especially from foreign studios, it's very, very telling, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. And I do want to get into a couple of Hollywood situations here. We might actually start with this MGM hurling film, and I think this pretty much does all the talking for us.
Here, my masters, are stalwart players on a hurling team. In case you haven't heard, hurling is an old Irish game, a sort of athletic manslaughter. The idea is to sock a ball with this pretty club, or bat, or shillelagh. During a game, however, a stalwart player is sometimes socked on his stalwart cranium with this pretty club, or bat, or shillelagh. Like in golf, the grip is important, or is it? The ball looks something like an indoor baseball, probably due to the fact that it is an indoor baseball. But there's plenty of technique to this good old Irish game, my friends. Even a simple ground shot calls for timing, coordination, and follow through. To bat a grounded ball over the heads of your opponents involves a bit of dexterity. Lifted thus, you now smite it with all your smite. Pun intended. A hurling player must stroke effectively both from the port and the starboard sides. In this shot, the ball is hit on the bounce, so. Then, too, you may help your teammates drive toward the goal by hitting it in flight, if you can. Played for hundreds of years, it's a fast he-man's game of skill and endurance, and no fooling. Watch your head, mister. Here comes a club. How nice. This gent is going to try to goal it from a very difficult side angle. I dare you to make it, fella. The opposing players must be back 21 feet and will try to prevent the ball from going over. Boy, what a drive. And look, it's going over. That's 1 point for the Greys. You can't lift the ball by hand to batter with the hurley, so you use a foot. Kinda cute. What? And now, swing, baby, swing. Here it comes, customers. And so, after a few days, when the Whites regain consciousness, they'll be overjoyed to hear that they won the game. Every gladiator sleeps. Yes, every gladiator sleeps.
So that's the work of MGM back in the day. Athletic manslaughter, they describe hurling as, which I presume is indicative of the view of Irish people and their games at the time.
Yeah, it's appalling in many respects, but it reflects a stereotype of the time, and perhaps one that still persists, of the Irish as having this particular propensity to violence, and you find it across. I mean, this is a short from MGM, but if you look across that period, 1930s, the gangster genre, for example, where you find people like James Cagney, probably most famously associated with the violent kind of Irish American criminal. So there was that association that this is connecting with. But it's also part of a larger context around sport and film in that period, in the 30s. You have great sport films in that period, like Harold Lloyd's The Freshman or the Marx Brothers, Horse Feathers, Buster Keating's College. And typically they use sport. There's the suggestion of violence, but there's also a lot of comedy. They're using it for the comic potential, and it's within that context as well. Because here, there is that really problematic suggestion of violence, and you associated with the hurling and the GAA were very unhappy, as you can imagine, at the time, and there was protests to the censor and to the company involved at the time by the GAA about the film, and it was apparently heavily edited. I imagine that last scene of the players all lying dead on the field.
It's pretty funny.
It is funny, and that's the context within which they were coming to it. It's a very different context in terms of Irish America and the way in which Irish America was evolving, of course, in this period, and was moving from. If you go back to the 19th century, where Irish people, you've heard the famous remarks about the signs, no blacks, no Irish. The Irish were kind of marginalised within American society. But in this period, there's the movement of the Irish and Irish America to the centre. And one of the strategies there was to turn previously negative stereotypes into more positive stereotypes. So you have the movement of the fighting associated with the Irish, which was seen as a kind of a threat to the mainstream American life, to it being seen ultimately as a sign of perseverance and of overcoming. And you have the Fighting Irish now, Notre Dame, for example. And it's in that context that you're encountering these films, where it's you're never really threatened by what you see. You're more amused by what you see in these films, and it's diffusing the kind of negative associations through comedy.
Exactly, and that's the whole point of satire, isn't it? It's to sort of diffuse that. Another one I want to play here, it's from 1958. It's Rooney. Shame on me for never seeing this before, because I found it absolutely brilliant, and maybe I'm kind of feeding into the anti-Irish stereotype of finding this hilarious. Here's one of the scenes. It involves a hurling match.
Hasn't he got hair in his head a foot long? I tell you, it was a dirty foul. You wouldn't take a mowing machine to scalp him. Who says so? Stop crying and take a beating like a man.
All right, I'll give you a bigger one myself.
Are you talking to me, are you?
I'm talking to any of you chicken-headed men who cares to listen to me.
Hey, is that the whistle? It was. Oh, somebody handed me a clout in there that's deafened me for life.
I'm sure I'm in for another black guy, and I just got rid of the first one. Who won the match?
I'm far too gone with the thirst to care. Listen, doesn't he get in the sack? Come on, let's have a drink.
And we'll drink to Rooney. But if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have had an argument at all.
We'll get that back. It's if you want to check it out, it's Rooney. It's fully available online. It's from 1958. Filmed at St. Vincents, was it, that particular scene?
Yes, it was. And it was that extraordinary Dublin player, Desi Snitchy Ferguson, that introduced John Gregson, the Liverpool-born actor who plays the hero of the story, James Ignatius Rooney, introduced him to hurling and tried, unfortunately with very little success. One of the things, the less convincing aspects of our film in particular are the hurling sequences, because they're trying to bring in this guy who wasn't really familiar with the sport and to train him up and to bring... And it really doesn't work. But there's other elements. In terms of capturing Dublin in the 1950s, I think it's still a fascinating record of that period. The way in which this is one of the things that was criticised, as you can imagine, at the time, was that that association of hurling with violence.
Does that stereotype change throughout the years after Rooney, or does it change at all from what you've seen?
It changes in the sense that, thankfully, from the 40s on, the indigenous, as in Irish-made productions, increasingly were focusing on Gaelic games. In a way, we could say we had the opportunity to film our own games and bring an authenticity and integrity to that, which wasn't about using them to affirm or to connect with stereotypes like this one here of violence and fighting, but about capturing the central role that these sports play in Irish life. And that's the National Film Institute, for example, and the work that they did, and subsequently the work of Gail Lynn, and right through to more recent extraordinary documentary filmmakers like Pat Comer, for example, and the work he's done. But in terms of international productions, regrettably, you still find the legacy of that association. I'm thinking of a relatively recent production like Blitz with Jason Statham.
We might actually have a look at Blitz now, because this comes with a warning of extremely strong language in this particular clip, but take it away, Jason Statham.
Okay, lads.
Fuck off, old man.
Come on, yeah, you git.
I'll smash your head in.
Yeah, give us your fucking wallet, you cunt. Sort this fucker out. Come on in. This, lads, is a hurling. Used in the Irish game of hurling. Cross between hockey and murder.
Jack you, bruv. Why don't I carve my name in your fucking face?
Hold on.
Give me the fucking name. Fucking go!
And is that a carpet knife? Stick it! Jesus wept. Been looking for one of these for like weeks. But this carpet just keeps turning up. A word of advice, girls. You're picking the wrong fight. At least pick the right weapon.
Always said Jason Statham will make a fine cornerback. That is Blitz, and a cross between hockey and murder. The line there about hurling, which is it's a great line, to be fair. But clearly, my question about has the view of GAA being a very violent sport, has that changed over the years? Clearly not. Not
in the perspective of the more kind of international mainstream genre films. It still is kind of employed in that context, unfortunately.
What's the best film that is spoken about in this movie, in your view? What's your favourite piece of work that involves Gaelic Games?
God, I think, we'd look at it from the point of view of different forms of film, and if I was to pick, in terms of fiction and Gaelic Games, probably still Clash of the Ash, Fergus Tighe's film from 1987, which is, it's made from somebody who's very, very close to the sport, who knows the sport intimately, who grew up playing it in Cork, and is bringing that kind of knowledge to the the filming of the sport, the capturing the importance of sport within a small community, but also as an insight to Irish society in a very dark period in the 1980s, a period marked by very high immigration, unemployment, lack of opportunity, and that's all kind of beautifully rendered within the film itself.
Yeah, it certainly is. And if I had to pick one, it would definitely be A Year Till Sunday. And I know you've mentioned Pat Comer there as well.
I was going to come to documentary, so that would be my documentary pick in terms of definitely. And A Year Till Sunday is it's a turning point as well in terms of the depiction of Gaelic Games, and that it literally brings us into the dressing rooms and brings us into it. There's a level of intimacy in terms of how the insight it gives us that only somebody on the panel who was in there and in the midst of it all could give. But you find the filming of Gaelic Games subsequently, and Pat has continued to be key, and in fact he's a series on RT1 at the moment, on the GA. That movement into more intimate, more insightful perspectives on Gaelic Games you find emerging subsequently and increasingly in television from the late 90s onwards.
It'd be great if the access wheel could kind of turn back around and more things like A Year Till Sunday will start to emerge, because the Blues Sisters documentary, for example, made last year was outstanding as well, kind of the same sort of level of access, which kind of leads to brilliant insight, as you say. Listen, it's called Gaelic Games and Film. It's by Sean Crosson, who's in studio with us this morning. It's fantastic, Sean, and congratulations on it. Thank you for popping in.
Thanks a million.